Alright, now that we know how to discharge a monitor, we're just going to go over some of the very basic things to keep track of before you essentially pull a monitor or a monitor board. Just little things to keep in mind. One of the biggest things I have to point out is obviously you're going to have to disconnect a few things. Power to the monitor, you're going to have to disconnect your degaussing coil, you're going to have to disconnect a connection between your yoke and your monitor boards. Numerous connections essentially that are going to have to come off. And I can't stress enough, especially if you're not too familiar with the game, haven't worked on it much, that you may not know exactly where those wires are going to go back. So keep track of what you're doing. I usually pull out the digital camera, snap a few pictures, just make sure the pictures are clear, show things you want to see, like how the connection is actually oriented in relation to other things on the monitor board, the colors of the wires. I mean, it's great to take a picture of a connector, but if it's all washed out with the flash and you can't see which wires are what color, it's not going to help you very much. And I also generally take notes. You know, I'll put down some type of representation of what is the top, bottom, front, you know, left, right, essentially, of the monitor or chassis, whatever, you know, I'm dealing with. And then I'll say, oh, this connector has the red wire closest to this side and the black wire closest to that side, etc. Coupled with pictures, the notes usually make it almost foolproof, but do what's best for yourself. Those are just a couple of suggestions. And now that you've got that straight, let's talk about the tools very briefly that you're going to need for doing a cap kit. Essentially, it's just a simple soldering project. So, of course, for soldering, you're going to need a soldering iron. This is just a basic $15 soldering iron that I got years ago. You can get them at Radio Shack, you can get them at a Fry's Electronics, any basic electronics store. You're also going to want some rosin flux. Basically, this helps loosen up your joints on your old solder. Also helps clean your soldering iron, the tip of it. I use this kind, which is basically a solid that you use your heated up soldering iron to just stick in it, get a little bit on, and then I either put it on the part, or once again, if I'm just cleaning the tip on the soldering iron, then wipe it off on a sponge. But there are other kinds and other options. They have this that comes in a little squeeze bottle, essentially squeeze it on the part you want. And they also have the kind that's like a flux pin. Essentially, it has a little brush on the tip of it. You just brush it on the connector you're about to desolder. Of course, you're going to need some solder. I just use a simple rosin core solder. It's from Radio Shack, very cheap. And as I mentioned before, your sponge, you're going to want a damp sponge around to wipe the tip of your soldering iron off on. Now, for desoldering, you got to get the old solder off there. So there's a couple options. But the one I like best is the wick. It's just a little braided piece of metal that essentially you put on the solder on the board, and you take your heated soldering iron and put it on top of the wick, and it'll melt the solder and suck it right into the wick. There are other options, as I said, such as a solder sucker tool, and I believe there's even soldering irons that may have a little vacuum built in. Those are all good options. Whatever you're most comfortable with, go ahead and use. As I said, I prefer the wick. Another couple of tools to keep handy would be some wire cutters. Remember, the caps you put in are going to have a little extra length on the leads, and you're going to want to cut them off so they don't bend over and touch other connections and cause shorts, etc. So little wire cutters or flush cutters are good to have. I also like to have a pair of needle nose pliers handy, because some of these boards have caps put in a little bit awkward places where you need to reach in, and really hard to get your fingers in there. So it helps to have the extra reach. Now let's talk very, very briefly about the capacitor. I pulled out a good sized one, so hopefully you can see it. I just wanted to go over the basic markings. Most capacitors have this black strip on there. And in the black strip, it should have a polarity marking. All the ones I've seen thus far have always been a negative polarity. It's possible they could also denote a positive polarity, I'm not sure. But go ahead and take a look and be certain. Now what that means is that your lead just under this would be your negative polarity, and your other one would of course be your positive polarity. That's important because most of these caps you're putting on in a cap kit on a monitor board are polarized caps. Some of them don't have polarity and are designated as a non-polarized cap, but most of them are polarized. Now these caps also have a value marking on them. This one, for example, is 100 UF, 160 volts. Now, important thing to note, because you probably will come across this, is that although the UF value needs to be the same, like I said, this one's a 100 UF cap, the voltage can actually be higher. So, for example, if I pulled this off of the board at position C225, I could put another cap back into C225 that had the same UF value as this cap, value of 100, but had a higher voltage value. Like I said, this one's 160 volts. I could actually put a cap that was 100 UF, 200 volt in that position, and it'd be just fine. And you will come across that in cap kits such as Bob Roberts' cap kits and what's not. And he will actually tell you that on the bottom of his cap kit sheet that that scenario comes into play and that it's just fine to go ahead and do that. Now, although this is not the actual monitor board I'm about to cap, I figured I'd pull it out because I had it handy, and it's very similar to most monitor boards. This is actually from an Electro Home G07, which you find in your Ms. Pac-Mans and Centipedes, etc. Many cabinets. At this point, you know, with the fact that people have swapped out monitors here and there, they could actually show up in virtually any cabinet, but they originally were in many Ms. Pac-Mans and Pac-Mans. The things to note that you're going to need to know, recognize, is that on this board, there's a bunch of little printed markings. And this one they're in green. And they actually show you, or tell you, what location something's at. For example, this cap right here says just below it has a marking of C411. So if I was to look on my Electro Home G07 cap kit sheet that I got from Bob Roberts, it would have a marking that said C411, and it would tell me the cap value. So I'd grab that cap value from the cap kit and pull it out. Of course, desolder this cap, pull it off, put the new one in place, keeping in mind the polarity, and I'd solder it on. Now, not all boards have this, but a lot of them do. They actually have those same markings that tell you the designation, the number of designation, and the polarity on the bottom of the board. So depending on which board you're dealing with, you may have to do a lot of flipping back and forth to make sure you're plugging the cap into the right place, or even finding the location here to desolder. But a good number of them also have this too, where you can just look, say, oh, I'm looking for cap C407, and I look and I say, oh, there it is, C407 right there. I just go ahead and desolder that, and then check the polarity, slip my cap through with the positive on the positive and the negative on the negative, solder it into place, and there you go. It's just that easy.